I love the holiday season because the holidays give me yet another excuse to craft. And one thing I really want to design and make is a punch needle Christmas stocking. I've seen a couple on social media here and there, and I want to try making one for myself. So let me take you through the entire process of designing and making this Christmas stocking. When I was designing the pattern for the stocking, I was debating between creating a more traditional looking stocking versus creating something more contemporary, funky, fresh. I decided to go with something more traditional because I love the look of traditional stockings and I wanted to see how well I could emulate them with punch needle. I drew up my pattern on Adobe Illustrator so that I could rescale it, and then I just printed it out on my home computer to trace. You're probably wondering why the pattern is taped together so weirdly. Well, it's because I wanted to fit it all onto one piece of monk's cloth. Now, if the stocking was a rug, I wouldn't be able to get away with taping and tracing the two sides of the stocking so close together. But I don't plan on hemming the stocking the same way I would a rug, so tracing both sides close together is a-okay. The thing though is that I thought I'd be able to trace them close enough together that I could get both of them completely onto my gripper frame, but alas, fabric stretches, so I could only get half of the second side. I'm actually really excited for this project because I'm using up a bunch of yarn and supplies that I had lying around for a while. I'm also excited because my stocking here features some advanced punch needle techniques like the bead stitch I'm currently doing right here. The bead stitch is super cool because it ends up creating this really interesting looking pattern here. I know this is a super common technique in traditional rug hooking, but I don't see it as much in punch needle. Maybe because people didn't really know how to make the stitch with punch needle until I think fairly recently. Going back to using up my yarn, I finally get to use up this tapestry yarn that I've been hoarding for months. I actually got it from one of my classmates during my punch needle certification lessons. I'm not joking with you right now. She literally had 3 large vacuum sealed bags of this tapestry yarn in every color imaginable, and she would not let me leave unless I took at least a couple of skeins off her. Not gonna lie, it's a pretty unique looking tapestry yarn, at least compared to like the DMC stuff, but I love the color and I feel like it would add a really cool texture to my stocking. The stocking gets pretty detailed. I'm using lots of fine yarns and I have a lot of detailed holiday motifs. I'm really hoping that they'll actually show up once I'm done punching and not just be blobs. I don't even know why I made it so detailed. We're taught in punch needle to simplify our super detailed designs so that we can capture everything accurately, but I don't know. In the spirit of Christmas, I felt like torturing myself with a million dots and X's. It was really no big deal though, because once I was done with those, I could switch over to some thicker yarn to fill in the body of the stocking. Now, you might be wondering why I'm using 2 shades of white. Well, I was originally only going to use the natural white, which is the outer row of stitches you see here, but I came to 2 realizations. Number 1, I might not have enough of that color to completely fill in both sides of the stocking. And number 2, I have some scrap fabric that I want to use as the lining for the stocking that's pure white. So I decided to fill the body of my stocking in using 1 row of natural white followed by 2 rows of bleached white, and repeating this process until I was done filling everything in. Now, doing this was fine, but punching with the same colors over and over again tends to be a little boring after a while. So I also got to punching the heel and toe of the stocking. Another fun fact, actually, the yellow that I'm using here is actually some of the leftover yarn that I hand dyed from back when I was working on my punch needle certification rug. Definitely go check that video out if you'd like. I think it's kind of my best video. It's so annoying having all of these tiny little balls of yarn lying around and not doing anything with them, so I'm glad to be using them up for this stocking. I will say that using up scraps is an easier task with punch needle than with other crafts like knitting and crochet, because I could have a super tiny yarn scrap, something like 5 to 6 inches, and be able to use that up just fine in punch needle. So we're done filling in the body of our stocking, and once we finish up the heel, we can get started with snipping and poking. Now, I always tell people to snip and poke as they punch. What this means is snipping off your long ends of yarn and poking your loops around so that they're in the right place. I tell people to do this as they're punching because if they don't, well, you end up with something like what you're seeing right now, which is a colossal mess of yarn ends and messed up loops. Can I clean this up and make it look nice? Absolutely. Will it be nice and fun and easy? Nope. So what you're gonna see is the teeniest, tiniest snippet of my snipping and poking the loops of my Christmas stocking. I did a lot more of this off camera, and let me just say, it was not fun. But in a certain way, I do get a do-over with this project because once I was done snipping and poking the loops of what I punched, it was time to do the exact same thing again with the other side of the stocking. I steam pressed the first side of my stocking before very carefully stretching my fabric onto my gripper frame here so that none of the loops would get caught in the grippers. Honestly, punching the other side of my stocking was way easier than the first side. Probably because I already had the experience of punching the pattern once, so I knew how to best fill it in strategically. I did make a tiny mistake with the second side of my stocking here because I drew the dots and X's in my pattern in a super weird way, so they just looked really weird. I had to go in and draw them in better places with a Sharpie so that they wouldn't look weird. Punching the second side of my stocking was also easier because I practiced what I preached for once and snipped and poked my work as I went along. Kind of. But I did end up finishing the second side a lot quicker, which meant that it was time to start constructing the stocking. And you're probably wondering what I do with all of the little yarn ends I have left over, because there are a ton. Well, I'm going to be making use of these for my next Christmas project, which you'll see in the coming days. When you take any punch needle piece off a frame or hoop, it doesn't lay flat. So the first thing I did was steam press both sides of my stocking. This is so funny, but the wool I use for punch needling is minimally processed. So when you get it wet, it ends up smelling like you got trampled by a horde of wet sheep. I really like the smell of it. I could honestly drop everything and go live on a sheep farm, but that's easier said than done. So let's get to hemming. We're going to hem this differently than we would a rug because we want to add a lining to this. People stuff all sorts of things into stockings, and it would kind of suck to have something get stuck on our yarn and rip out our work. So what we're going to do is draw out a nice small outline around our stockings here. This is a very small outline. I want to say less than maybe ½ inch. And a small outline like this is very risky to cut out on its own because monk's cloth frays a ton. So what I'm gonna do is seal it with a mixture of white glue and water. When I first heard about this technique, I was super iffy about it because I was always under the impression that glue equals bad, but it's not like we're gonna be gluing our stitches or our yarn. And I've actually seen folks at the Oxford company using this technique, and I trust them with everything punch needle. You'd normally use a paintbrush for this, but I couldn't find my brushes, so I'm using a Q-tip to add a thin layer of this glue mix on the outlines I made to prevent my monk's cloth from fraying. This is super scuffed, I know. You could also use fray check for this, which I do have, but you need good ventilation for fray check, and it is way too cold and snowy outside for me to be opening any windows or doors. So I'm gonna wait for that to dry, and once it's dry, I'm gonna cut it out right on the lines so that I get both sides of my Christmas stocking out. And as you can see, we have quite a bit of monk's cloth here that is actually still usable, so you can absolutely bet that I'm gonna be using up all of these scraps. Now, what I'm gonna do is cut out the lining pieces for this stocking. I have some scrap cotton flannel that I'm hoping is enough for the lining pieces. I ironed it out so that it would be nice and wrinkle-free. I have a water-soluble marker here and my paper patterns of the stocking, and I'm marking quite a bit outside the stocking pattern for the lining pieces, and you'll see why. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it does have to be bigger than the stockings themselves. So I'm gonna cut these out and, again, save this scrap fabric because we can reuse it. Let's grab one side of our stocking here. I'm taking some pins and pinning the excess fabric in. I don't know what these pins are called, but I found them in my house and I'm kind of obsessed with them. I'm not worried at all about the fabric overlapping or folding over itself. I just want to make sure that all of the excess fabric here is pinned under. Once I've done that, I'm going to grab one piece of my lining fabric, which, as you can see now, is quite a bit bigger than the stocking itself. Now, the reason why I cut the lining fabric to be bigger is so that we have enough allowance to fold in to start making an invisible stitch. I'm just using some regular cotton thread and a needle and making an invisible stitch. The goal is to cover up all of the monk's cloth that's showing, so I'm really bringing my needle right to the edge next to my stitches so that once I'm done, you don't see any monk's cloth. And again, I'm not worried about my lining fabric folding in on itself. That's fine, as long as there's enough to cover the inside of my stocking here. The one thing I probably should have done from the start, and what I ended up doing after a bit, is moving the pins I placed on my monk's cloth on top of the lining fabric so that the lining could be pinned in place and not be bumpy. But once I did that, I repeated the same process with the other side of the stocking so that I could have both sides of the stocking lined and ready for me to sew together. Now, I just want to make sure that both sides of my stocking here are lined up together so that I don't sew them together crooked. And normally, to make sure that things aren't crooked, I use clover clips, but clover clips are way too small for this. So I did a little bit of improvisation and used a claw clip that I would use for my hair to line them up together. And now for sewing them together, I did exactly what I did with the lining and sewed both sides together using an invisible stitch. Now, I can't sew the whole stocking together just yet because I need to be able to hang it up. So I sewed one side up just so I could have the right amount of space to add a ribbon. I was debating what color ribbon to use, but I ultimately went with red because of the red accents in the stocking. I felt like that was the right aesthetic decision. I cut the ends of this ribbon with some pinking shears just because those tend to prevent fraying. I played around with the placement of the ribbons for a bit, and once I got them in the right spot, I pinned them in place and sewed them right onto the stocking. I don't trust my sewing machine to be able to handle sewing something so thick, so I ended up just sewing the ribbon on by hand. Now, this works, but it doesn't look very pretty. And the question we should all be asking ourselves is, how can we make this prettier? My answer to that for this stocking is to add a cute little patch. And I have some scrap wool fabric to do just that. Adding a patch will cover up my ugly stitches and also add reinforcements for the ribbon. And it'll also be functional because I can use this as a label. I don't think I can embroider my whole name onto this, so I just embroidered the letter V using a backstitch. Unfortunately, this fabric scrap is too small for any hoop, so I had to just hold it in my hand and hope for the best as I was making these stitches. And you know what? It doesn't look too bad. It's giving Charlie Brown Christmas, which is really nice. So I'm gonna cut it out, pin it to my stocking, and sew it on using a blanket stitch. I love the blanket stitch, it looks so nice. And luckily I have some red embroidery floss, so the stitches can blend in really nicely. And once we finish this, we can sew up the rest of our stocking. If anyone is making stockings of any kind at home, I just want you to remember to not sew up the top. I was so locked in during this and so completely focused on sewing that I almost didn't notice that I was at the top and done sewing together my stocking. Now all that's left is a final cleanup with my sticky roller and lint remover, and here's the finished stocking. I'm actually quite happy with it. I think it looks great. And it's quite big. I can fit my arm in up to my elbow, which is kind of impressive. The details came out really nicely as well. I am obsessed with the bell motif. Very festive, very cutesy, and very usable. Hope you all enjoyed this one. Thanks so much for watching. I do have one more Christmassy holiday craft that I'm hoping to show you soon. So make sure to subscribe so you know when my next videos come out. Hope you're just as excited for the holidays as I am. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.